Hi everyone, yeah, welcome back. Good to see you again. You're looking well. Get yourself a drink and a seat up front. We're going to get started. Because, yes, there's a show. It's all been happening and now you want to know. But before we can start, we must begin with hello. My name is Sean, your host and fellow. Now grab hold your beverage, your mind just as quick. We're building up for our best sip. So join me now for the greatest pleasure, where we unwind this world together. It's time now. It's time for the sip. Let's do it now. Let's do it quick. Go! Delicious. Well, a zoo in Jingzhou province in China were very proud of their new panda exhibition. The two new panda editions becoming a global sensation almost overnight, but not for the reasons you may think. Onlookers were amazed when the pandas started wagging their tails, and then became confused when the pandas started barking and panting like a dog. Yes, two fluffy Chow Chow dogs had been clipped and painted to look like pandas. The cherry on the cake was when the spokesperson for the zoo said, "Normal people dye their hair, dogs can dye their hair too." Well, I guess that's what happens when a legitimate business tries to pander to the public. Meanwhile, on his way to China, President Trump is headed there with several very senior business leaders, including Elon Musk, Jensen Huang of Nvidia, and Tim Cook of Apple fame. No doubt human rights will be on the agenda. China has long been accused of rights abuses, all the way from clamping down on free speech to outright imprisonment of whole ethnicities like the Uyghurs. Free speech was most prominently attacked when a newspaper owner called Jimmy Lai, who runs the famous opposition magazine called Apple Daily, was arrested and put in prison. The magazine was based in Hong Kong, or based and operated out of Hong Kong, for a number of years. I've actually been to Hong Kong, and it was a very cool place, I have to say. One of the few places I've been where you can go out at 2 a.m. and the streets are absolutely packed with people. Lots of street vendors, selling all sorts of things, food and trinkets and whatever you want. Going to the tea houses in Lan Kwai Fong and going to the tech centres in Shim Sha Tsui was quite the experience. I even went to Macau, which is a little island off of Hong Kong, known for its mega casinos, and as the mainland doesn't really allow any gambling. So it became a place where all the playboys and the rich business tycoons would go and spend their cash. The Vegas of the East, if you like. I went by Hydrofall ferry, which took about an hour. Very comfortable, very nice. Macau itself is a pretty cool place. It's an ex-Portuguese colony, so you've got all these beautiful old Portuguese buildings and cobbled streets, but lots of Chinese people everywhere. So it's just a cool atmosphere. It's a cool place to be. One of the most surprising experiences for me personally was going to a popular restaurant down south on the island, and I sat down there to eat, and it was a fish restaurant, primarily fish restaurant, I think, and there was a box of liquid fruit sat next to me, which if you're not in the know, it's a South African fruit drink, which was very strange to see in the middle of nowhere. I don't know, 15, 20,000 miles away from where it originated. And this was quite a long time ago. It was back in 2005. So, it was definitely not as global as things are now, but it was a cool experience. Since then, since 2005, basically, it's Hong Kong has become a much more restrictive place. The British government handed Hong Kong back to China about 10 years ago now, I think it was. And the Chinese government has been cracking down pretty hard on all kinds of protests and any kind of rhetoric that the government doesn't like, which is pretty unsurprising, really, because that's what happens on the mainland. It's been that is the de facto standard at the moment. So this newspaper, the Apple Daily in particular, has been targeted. As I said, owned by Jimmy Lai. It's a bit of a cheap rag mag, but it has been challenging the government and what they've been doing and saying for a long time. which is okay when the country is strong on has strong freedom of speech laws, as was the case when Hong Kong, was before it was handed over to China. But after being handed over, China had a couple of years where they were just testing the waters or just letting everything settle. But pretty soon new laws were introduced, and shortly after that, Jimmy Lai was arrested. He's been tried and thrown in jail, and I think he was put in jail about 4 years ago now. I think it's 2027, 2028 that he's expected to get out. And it's not uncommon to see these kind of political activists ending up in situations like this in China. Jimmy is just one of the most well-known ones, really, in the West. But there are many like him. So, yeah, hopefully Trump will be bringing that up, along with the other issues of free speech and more open politics in China. Hopefully he'll be able to even maybe bring back Jimmy Lai. But I think he'll have to raise that case with Xi when he's there. I doubt Jimmy will be sprung from jail for the trip, but it'd be a pretty fanciful thought if that were the case. But ultimately, she could still offer clemency as an act of goodwill, but I wouldn't expect it. So yeah, moving on to the trip itself, a lot of very senior business leaders are joining Trump on the trip. It seems a bit unusual. I can't really think of many state visits that have included other business leaders like this. And security is obviously first and foremost in mind. But yeah, I don't think China's going to do anything. It'll be very bad look for them. They'll lose a lot of face doing so. Face is very important in China. You've got to always look respectable and look, like you're doing the right thing. And this would just be, so off the reservation. It wouldn't go down well. And I also think they'd come off second best in that exchange because no doubt the US would have some way of responding there. So even then, you normally wouldn't really gather this many people like this to spend a long time negotiating. Because it's only for 2 days that they're there, but they wouldn't drag that kind of group of people over there to go negotiate something, unless maybe the deal has already been done and it's already been negotiated. Trump does like to set out the table, as he calls it, before going into these things, and it almost certainly feels like he would have stacked the deck in his favor on this one too. So if you just look at the moves that's happened in places like Venezuela and Iran, they've got major connections to China. China receives a lot of their oil from them, and probably about a third of their oil goes to China from those countries, just those countries alone. China does have the largest strategic oil reserves in the world at about 1.4 billion barrels, I should say. And they consume about 16 million a day. They only produce about 4.5 a day, though, 4.5 million a day. So, yeah, chopping a third of the imports off, if they don't get replaced, mean China would last about a year before running out. As I mentioned, the tariffs are also a big stick that Trump will be wielding, and as he tries to push through some agreement of some kind. But yeah, this all looks part of a big power play to set up negotiations that we're going to be seeing this week. Then onto the tech stuff. China has been sanctioned for a year now, preventing it from accessing modern American chips, basically. And those are incredibly important for AI at the moment. They are far more efficient than what is available elsewhere. It hasn't stopped them from actually getting any of it, though. I think if you've been looking at the socials for any length of time, especially about 7-8 months ago, there are quite a few examples and photographs where pallet loads of these NVIDIA cards, like 5090s and things, were arriving in China from third-party destinations. So while you may be able to sanction China itself, it doesn't stop friendly countries to China importing them and then selling them on to China for a little profit. Sanctions have basically pushed China now to start developing their own processors. So yeah, while they're not the same level as the Western efforts, they're not that far behind. Maybe like 8 to 10 years or so. It's like I think at the moment we're approaching like a one nanometer processor, and in China it's at a seven nanometer at the moment. So yeah, it's more than respectable. You'll be able to create some extremely fast processors, things that are more than capable of doing the job. And the thing is, you can scale that up. So if you just have pure quantity involved, ignoring power, you can actually have the same amount of compute just simply through raw, scale. So yeah, China's pushing to do that themselves. And one reason that they can do it is because China has been so prolific in stealing the IP of other countries, and other companies. There's been numerous stories of them, spies found from China, information being sent back to China, Chinese citizens being under obligation to do what the CCP wants, even when they're in other countries. So yeah, so that's one thing that they have in their favor, is that they have a lot of the starting diagrams. It doesn't mean they have the machines, but it means that they'll know how it's supposed to work and can design and build machines that can do what they need. In some cases, they may even have the schematics or the ways of actually constructing those foundries. So yeah, things will definitely change. As China often does with these things, they don't rely on just one thing working. They'll sort of throw 20 things at it. If you think in the West, there's maybe Intel, AMD, Nvidia that actually are the major chip providers. Apple makes their own silicon, as we know, at the moment, and Tesla are also in the just starting that market now. They're primarily looking to make their own things. I think Tesla are talking about being able to contract out that foundry, but it's nothing's ready yet. You do have ARM, which does design things for other companies, but they don't really manufacture anything themselves or try and create a product themselves. But yes, they'll only be doing that to the major big players anyway. So yeah. By contrast, China has dozens of chip designers, chip making companies, and over 50 chip foundries as well in the country. Many of them are quite low-grade facilities. They wouldn't be able to produce like a modern processor, for example, but they can. Some of them can produce some pretty functional processors at the moment. The US, by comparison, has only got really 2 operational modern fabs, with the rest of it coming from Taiwan. Taiwan is obviously another flashpoint that is no doubt going to be spoken about. But yeah, Taiwan is vulnerable just due to their sheer proximity to China. So no doubt the trip is going to be looking at resetting those relations and opening up markets again. US companies that were initially allowed in to partake in China tend to find themselves getting squeezed out by the Chinese companies once the locals understand how it works and they've got the tooling and the machinery to kind of get themselves going. They just start to make their own and start pushing you out the door, which is probably indicative of what the global ambition is at the moment. Then there's the Opium Wars, that thing that happened back in the 1840s. China hasn't forgotten that. China used to supply a lot more drugs directly, but that has reduced somewhat with new restrictions being put in place. That didn't stop them from selling precursors, though, to actually make the drugs to countries still, in fairly large quantities at that. Business is business, after all. So previous trade negotiations have focused on reducing this precursor availability. There's some evidence that it has worked, as the quality of fentanyl, for example, has decreased since 2024, which is a sign that it's harder to get those precursor chemicals. So yeah, I expect there to be some kind of announcement related to all of this from the trip. I think that would make Scott Adams quite happy, because his stepson died of an overdose. He was very vocal about these precursors and the drugs coming from China at the time. So it'll be a positive development if that happens. I think my main concern with the Trump visit is, getting there and President Xi's like, yes, sir, no problem, and then goes back to their 100-year plan. Because yes, China has a 100-year plan, and they basically go for the long game. So all of their short-term and medium-term activities are driven by that plan. Doesn't really tend to be affected by external influences that much, unless it benefits them in some way. So the goal, obviously, of that plan is to bring Chinese dominance to the world. And really, that is one major strategic advantage China has over the West. We're in the West, like every 4 years, we're trying to figure out, we've got people fighting over who's the boss and promise all sorts of things, to try and convince you that, they're the ones that are going to deliver this time. Half that time in those 4 years is spent, electioneering and avoiding saying the wrong things because you don't want the electorate to be upset. So when the new guy starts, it's just they look at the last 2.5 years and they go, oh, we'll just cross that out and reverse everything. So, yeah, there's this constant tug of war between the parties and society in the middle. It is useful to be able to change leadership when you need to, especially if things are not working and not performing. But 4 years is probably a bit short, I think, to have any kind of long-lasting, meaningful change. You kind of have to go in there with all guns blazing and hope that you get a couple of successive terms. So, yeah, the Chinese have that advantage on their side. They can wait it out if they don't like what Trump is offering. It does seem, though, that this trip may be about resetting relationships with China. Trump has set out the table, and this trip should be about closing a deal that should hopefully already be in the pipeline. So, yeah, we could see a big shift in global power because of this. Having a country the size of China and having the country the size of the US agree to these things is pretty world defining. Besides, if the delegation does have to go away empty-handed, then maybe Trump could think about renaming Hong Kong Hongking. And that brings me to the end of my notes. And I'll leave you with one final saying, which is Ying Shui Zi Xuan, which roughly means, if I haven't done a bad job there, when you drink the water, remember the spring the source of the water came from. And that roughly means we need to appreciate the ones who originally gave us what we have. And I think that's quite sweet. And many Chinese proverbs are like that, very sweet. So with that, I shall wish you well and say see you later. Cheers.